She still thinks everything belongs to her. That was the message I was never supposed to see, and the moment I read it, something inside me changed forever. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was 72 years old, a widow, and until that day, I believed I had one of the closest families a woman could hope for. My husband Harold and I had spent nearly 50 years building a life together in Jacksonville, Florida. We raised our son Michael in a modest home, taught him the value of honesty, and worked hard to create a future we could all be proud of. When Harold passed away 18 months earlier, I thought the hardest part of my life had already happened. I was wrong. After Harold died, Michael and his wife Rachel became a constant presence in my life. Rachel called almost every day. She brought over homemade soup when I was sick. She helped organize family gatherings. She hugged me every time she visited and always called me Mom. Whenever friends commented on how lucky I was to have such a caring daughter-in-law, I agreed wholeheartedly. I trusted her completely. That trust lasted until a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early spring. Rachel had stopped by the house to help me sort through several boxes of old photographs from the attic. We spent most of the afternoon laughing over faded vacation pictures and school portraits from decades ago. Everything felt normal, comfortable, familiar. Around 3 o'clock, Rachel stepped outside to take a phone call while leaving her tablet on the dining room table. I had no reason to pay attention to it. In fact, I was not even looking in its direction. Then a notification appeared on the screen. The message flashed for only a moment, but it was impossible to miss. She still thinks everything belongs to her. My eyes froze on the words. At first, I assumed there had to be some misunderstanding. Perhaps it was about someone else. Perhaps I had read it incorrectly. Yet before the notification disappeared, I saw the sender's name. It belonged to a friend Rachel often talked about. My stomach tightened. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. One message does not tell an entire story. Still, I could not ignore the strange feeling growing inside me. A few minutes later, Rachel returned smiling exactly as she always did. She sat beside me, picked up an old photograph of Harold, and spoke kindly about how much she missed him. If I had not seen that message, I would have believed every word without question. Instead, I found myself studying her face, looking for something I had never looked for before. Was there guilt hidden behind that smile? Was I imagining things? The rest of the afternoon passed normally. Rachel laughed. She helped carry boxes back upstairs. Before leaving, she hugged me and reminded me to call if I needed anything. I smiled and thanked her. Not once did I mention the message. Not once did I ask a question. That evening, after she left, I sat alone on my back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. The air felt warm, but I could not shake the chill settling over my thoughts. For the first time since Harold died, I found myself wondering whether the people closest to me were keeping something from me. And as darkness slowly covered the yard, I realized a troubling truth. Sometimes betrayal does not begin with an argument. Sometimes it begins with a smile. For the next several days, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. One message was not evidence of a conspiracy. It was not proof of betrayal. Yet no matter how many times I repeated that thought, the feeling refused to leave. Once doubt enters a relationship, even the smallest details begin to look different. The following weekend, Michael and Rachel invited me to dinner. This was not unusual. Since Harold passed away, they had made a point of including me in family meals whenever possible. I arrived carrying a peach cobbler I had baked that morning. Rachel greeted me at the door with her usual warmth. She hugged me tightly and told me how happy she was that I came. If someone had filmed that moment, they would have seen a loving daughter-in-law welcoming her husband's mother into a happy home. I smiled back, but something inside me had changed. For the first time, I was paying attention. During dinner, I noticed how often Rachel guided conversations. When Michael mentioned a recent home improvement project, Rachel quickly shifted the discussion toward future planning. When I talked about planting new flowers in my backyard, Rachel asked whether maintaining the property was becoming difficult. The question sounded innocent, helpful even, yet I remembered the message. She still thinks everything belongs to her. The words lingered in the back of my mind. After dessert, the grandchildren went upstairs, leaving the three of us alone at the table. Michael began talking about a coworker whose mother had recently moved into a retirement community. Rachel immediately seemed interested. She described the amenities, the activities, and the convenience. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but I noticed something unusual. They spoke as though the topic had already been discussed many times before. Neither of them asked what I thought. They simply exchanged observations with one another. Driving home that evening, I found myself replaying every word. Part of me hated what I was doing. Rachel had been kind to me for years. She had supported Michael through difficult times. She adored her children. She volunteered at community events. She did not fit the image of someone secretly plotting against another person. That contradiction troubled me more than anything else. The following Tuesday, I met my longtime friend Carol Benson for coffee. Carol had known me for nearly 20 years. She listened quietly as I described the message without embellishment. When I finished, she stirred her coffee and looked at me carefully. "What bothers you most?" she asked. I thought about the question for a moment. "The message itself is not the worst part," I said. "It is the possibility that I no longer know who I can trust." Carol nodded slowly. "Then do not make any decisions yet. Just observe." Her advice sounded simple, but it stayed with me. Observe. That afternoon, I returned home and sat in Harold's favorite chair by the living room window. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. The house felt quiet, familiar, safe. Yet for the first time since his death, I wondered if conversations about my future were happening somewhere without my knowledge. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I reached a decision. I would not confront Rachel. I would not accuse anyone of anything. If there was truly something hidden beneath all those smiles and kind words, the truth would reveal itself eventually. All I had to do was watch carefully enough to see it. Over the next 2 weeks, I followed Carol's advice. I observed. I listened. Most importantly, I stopped dismissing things that felt unusual. The change was subtle at first. Rachel called more often than before. Sometimes she checked on me twice in a single day. If my lawn needed mowing, Michael appeared with his equipment before I could ask for help. If a light bulb burned out, Rachel immediately suggested hiring someone to handle household maintenance. Their concern seemed endless. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of support many widows wish they had. Yet the more attention they gave me, the more uncomfortable I became. One Saturday morning, Rachel arrived carrying coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. We sat together on the back porch overlooking the garden Harold and I had planted years ago. The conversation began normally. We talked about the weather, family updates, and a local charity event. Then Rachel casually mentioned that she had been researching ways older homeowners could simplify their lives. She described services that handle maintenance, finances, and transportation. Her tone remained cheerful and encouraging. I simply nodded and listened. A few days earlier, I might have considered the conversation harmless. Now I noticed something different. Rachel rarely asked what I wanted. Instead, she spoke about what would supposedly make life easier for me. The distinction was small but important. As the days passed, similar conversations continued. Michael stopped by one evening and asked whether I still kept all of Harold's financial files in the study. Another afternoon, Rachel wondered if I had ever considered downsizing. Each question sounded reasonable by itself. Together, however, they formed a pattern that was becoming difficult to ignore. The most revealing moment happened unexpectedly at a family barbecue. Michael and Rachel invited several friends and neighbors to their house. I spent most of the afternoon talking with people I had known for years. At one point, I walked into the kitchen to refill my glass of iced tea. As soon as I entered the room, the conversation stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Rachel and another woman were standing near the counter. Michael was seated at the table. All three looked at me for a fraction of a second before smiling. "We were just talking about vacation plans," Rachel said quickly. Her explanation arrived too fast, too rehearsed. I smiled politely and continued pouring my drink. Nobody said anything unusual after that. Yet I could feel it. The shift in energy. The awkward silence. The sense that I had interrupted a discussion that was never intended for me. Driving home later that evening, I replayed the scene repeatedly. It was not proof of anything. Still, it reminded me of the message on Rachel's tablet. The same uneasy feeling returned. A week later, another small incident caught my attention. I arrived at Michael's house to drop off a birthday gift for one of the grandchildren. Rachel answered the door and invited me inside. As we walked toward the kitchen, I noticed several printed documents spread across the dining room table. The moment Rachel saw me looking in that direction, she quickly gathered the papers into a folder. Her smile never disappeared. "Just some household paperwork," she said casually. I nodded. Once again, I asked no questions. By then, I had learned something important. People reveal more when they believe they are not being challenged. That night, sitting alone in Harold's old chair, I realized my concerns were no longer based on a single message. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Questions about my finances appeared more frequently. Discussions about my future seemed to be happening without my participation. Whatever Rachel was planning, it was becoming larger than I first imagined. And for the first time, I began to suspect that I was the only person who had not been informed. The breakthrough came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when I was least expecting it. Rachel had invited me to lunch at a small cafe near the riverfront, one of those pleasant places filled with retirees, tourists, and people enjoying the Florida sunshine. The meal itself was uneventful. Rachel chatted about the grandchildren, a school fundraiser, and a neighbor who was renovating her kitchen. She smiled often. She laughed easily. To anyone watching us, we looked like family members enjoying a peaceful afternoon together. Yet by then, I had learned to listen carefully to what was not being said. Near the end of lunch, Rachel excused herself to take a phone call outside. I remained at the table sipping iced tea and looking through the large front windows. A few minutes later, she returned looking slightly distracted. She apologized, paid the bill, and offered to drive me home. During the ride, her phone connected automatically to the car's audio system. Almost immediately, a notification appeared on the dashboard screen. The message itself lasted only a second before disappearing, but I caught enough of it to make my heart skip. It contained my name. More specifically, it contained my full legal name. Rachel quickly pressed a button and cleared the notification. She continued talking as though nothing had happened. I said nothing. By now, silence had become my greatest advantage. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about the message. Why would my full legal name appear in a conversation that seemed unrelated to me? The question lingered in my thoughts long after sunset. 2 days later, another strange event occurred. I attended a charity luncheon hosted by a local community organization where I had volunteered for years. During the reception, I ran into a woman named Susan Keller. Susan worked part-time for a financial planning office and had always been friendly. After exchanging pleasantries, she asked a question that immediately caught my attention. "How are you feeling about everything?" she asked. I smiled politely. "About what?" Her expression changed. "Oh, I thought you were already discussing your transition plans." I stared at her. "What transition plans?" Susan looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I may have misunderstood something," she said quickly. "Please forget I mentioned it." Then, she excused herself and walked away. I remained standing there long after she left. The room suddenly felt warmer, louder, more crowded. For the second time in a matter of weeks, someone outside my family seemed to know something about my future that I did not know myself. Driving home, I realized a troubling pattern was emerging. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. People asked unusual questions about my plans. Rachel and Michael repeatedly discussed housing, finances, and convenience. And now complete strangers appeared to believe major decisions were already being considered. That evening, I sat alone in my study surrounded by family photographs and old memories. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a clock Harold had received as a retirement gift many years ago. As I looked around the room, a painful realization settled over me. Whatever discussions were happening behind closed doors had expanded far beyond casual family conversations. Other people were involved now. Information was circulating. Assumptions were being made. And somehow, the person whose life was being discussed remained the last person informed. For the first time since this began, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. Instead, I began asking a different question. How much had already been decided without me? The answer arrived the following Monday, and unlike every clue that came before it, this one left very little room for doubt. That morning, I was watering the flowers near my front porch when I heard my computer alert me to a new email. Normally, I checked messages only once or twice a day, but something prompted me to go inside immediately. The email had been forwarded from Rachel's address. At first, I assumed it was another family update or a photograph of the grandchildren. Then I noticed the subject line. It contained my full name followed by the words long-term planning. My pulse quickened. I opened the message and immediately realized it had not been intended for me. Rachel had forwarded it accidentally while sending information to someone else. The email chain included several earlier messages. Most had been exchanged between Rachel and a representative from a senior housing advisory service. I read every line slowly. carefully. The language remained polite and professional throughout, but the content was impossible to ignore. Rachel had provided details about my age, my home, my financial situation, and possible timelines for a future move. She had asked about housing options, waiting lists, and recommendations for older adults transitioning out of private residences. One sentence stopped me cold. We are hoping to help her understand that remaining in the house is no longer the best long-term solution. I read that sentence 3 times. Not because I misunderstood it, because I wanted to be certain I had not imagined it. There was in plain English. Decisions about my future were being discussed with outside organizations. Recommendations were being requested. Plans were being explored. Yet no one had ever asked me what I wanted. I sat quietly at my desk, staring out the window toward the backyard Harold and I had spent decades caring for together. Strangely, I did not feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was disappointment. A deep, heavy disappointment that settled into my chest. The email continued for several pages. Most of it focused on logistics, housing availability, and support services. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Yet every message carried the same assumption. My future was being planned by people who believed they already knew what was best for me. The most painful part came near the end of the exchange. A representative had asked whether I was aware of these discussions. Rachel's response was brief. Not yet. We are working on the right approach. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Suddenly the message on the tablet made sense. The conversations that stopped when I entered rooms made sense. The strange questions, the housing brochures, the comments from strangers, all of it connected. For months, a plan had been quietly taking shape around me. Later that afternoon, Rachel called as if it were any other day. Her voice sounded cheerful. She asked about my garden and whether I needed help with groceries. I answered politely, calmly, the same way I always had. Not once did I mention the email. Not once did I reveal what I knew. By then, I understood something important. Information was power. And for the first time since this entire situation began, the balance had shifted. Rachel still believed I was unaware of what had been happening behind my back. She still believed she controlled the conversation. As I ended the call and looked once more at the email sitting on my screen, I realized she had made a mistake far more significant than sending a message to the wrong address. She had shown me exactly what she was planning. And now, I intended to learn how far those plans truly went. After discovering the email, I stopped searching for answers and started gathering understanding. There was a difference. Answers tell you what happened. Understanding tells you why. Over the following week, I behaved exactly as I always had. I answered Rachel's calls. I attended family dinners. I smiled when the grandchildren showed me their school projects. If Rachel suspected I had seen the email, she never showed it. In fact, she seemed more confident than ever. That confidence became increasingly revealing. During one visit, she casually mentioned a retirement community located about 20 miles outside Jacksonville. She described the walking paths, the social activities, and the maintenance services. Her presentation sounded almost rehearsed. I listened quietly while stirring my coffee. It sounds very nice, I said. Rachel smiled with visible relief. I thought you might think so. The reaction told me more than her words. She had expected resistance. Instead, she believed she was making progress. A few days later, Michael stopped by to help replace a faulty outdoor light fixture near my garage. While working, he mentioned how difficult it could be for older homeowners to keep up with property maintenance. Once again, the subject appeared without invitation. Once again, the conversation pointed toward the same destination. I noticed something else as well. Michael seemed uncomfortable discussing it. Unlike Rachel, he never pushed. He simply repeated ideas that sounded familiar, as though he had heard them many times before. The realization saddened me. I began to suspect that Rachel was not merely influencing the conversation. She was shaping it. That Friday afternoon, I met Carol for lunch and finally told her about the email. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat quietly for several moments. So now you know, she said. I nodded. Yes. What are you going to do? She asked. I looked out the restaurant window toward a row of palm trees moving gently in the breeze. Nothing yet. Carol raised an eyebrow. I smiled. People reveal more when they believe they are succeeding. She laughed softly. That sounds like something Harold would have said. Hearing his name brought an unexpected warmth to my chest. Harold had always been patient, deliberate. He never rushed important decisions. That evening, after returning home, I opened the study closet and removed a locked file box that had not been touched in months. Inside were estate documents, trust records, property information, and personal letters Harold had organized years earlier. We had spent countless evenings discussing financial planning and long-term security. Harold believed preparation was an act of love. Looking through those files, I realized just how carefully he had prepared for situations neither of us could predict. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I felt something close to confidence. Rachel believed she understood my future. She believed she had already mapped out the next chapter of my life. What she did not understand was that Harold and I had spent decades preparing our own plans. Plans built on independence, choice, and personal dignity. As I returned the documents to the file box, another realization settled over me. The email had exposed Rachel's intentions, but intentions were not the same as outcomes. She still believed I was unaware. She still believed she controlled the situation. And because of that belief, she was about to reveal far more than she ever intended. The invitation arrived the following week, and the moment I saw Rachel's name on my phone, I knew the next stage of her plan had finally arrived. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost excited. She explained that she and Michael wanted to have a family meeting at their house on Saturday afternoon. According to Rachel, it would be a chance to discuss long-term plans and make sure everyone was on the same page moving forward. I agreed immediately. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but after hanging up, I sat quietly in my kitchen for a long time. There was no uncertainty left now. The discussions that had been happening behind my back were about to be brought into the open. Saturday arrived with clear skies and warm weather. I spent the morning tending to my garden, watering flowers, and trimming a few shrubs near the front walkway. The familiar routine helped calm my thoughts. By the time I drove to Michael and Rachel's house, I felt completely composed. The grandchildren were spending the afternoon with friends, leaving the house unusually quiet. Rachel greeted me at the door with a warm smile and led me into the dining room. Immediately, I noticed several folders arranged neatly on the table. Beside them sat a tablet and a legal pad filled with handwritten notes. Rachel had clearly prepared for this conversation. Michael looked less comfortable. He smiled when I entered, but there was tension in his expression. After a few minutes of small talk, Rachel began. She spoke about family responsibilities, future planning, and making smart decisions before circumstances forced difficult choices. Her presentation was polished and organized. She discussed maintenance costs, property taxes, home repairs, and the challenges many older homeowners eventually face. Then she opened one of the folders. Inside were photographs of retirement communities, independent living residences, and maintenance-free neighborhoods. I recognized some of the same organizations mentioned in the email I had received by mistake. Rachel carefully explained the benefits of each option. Organized activities, transportation services, on-site maintenance, social opportunities. Every point sounded reasonable. Every sentence sounded helpful. Yet throughout the entire presentation, one thing never changed. Nobody asked what I wanted. They simply explained what would supposedly be best for me. Michael occasionally added comments about safety and convenience. Rachel handled most of the discussion herself. As I listened, I realized how thoroughly she had convinced herself that this plan was an act of kindness. That was what made the situation so complicated. She did not see herself as controlling my future. She saw herself as improving it. When the presentation finally ended, silence settled across the room. Rachel folded her hands and looked directly at me. "We just want you to be happy," she said softly. "And we think it may be time to consider something different." Michael nodded in agreement. They waited for my response. Weeks earlier, I might have felt overwhelmed. I might have confronted them about the emails, the conversations, and the secrets. Instead, I simply smiled. "I appreciate the effort both of you have put into this," I said calmly. The relief on Rachel's face appeared instantly. She thought I was accepting her proposal. She thought months of planning had finally succeeded. Neither of them realized that I already knew far more than they imagined. As the meeting concluded and the folders remained spread across the table, I found myself thinking about the locked file box waiting inside my study at home. Rachel believed she had prepared for this moment. What she did not know was that Harold had prepared for it years ago. And very soon, both Rachel and Michael were going to discover just how much they had overlooked. 3 days after the family meeting, I called Michael and Rachel and invited them to dinner at my house. Neither seemed surprised. In fact, Rachel sounded pleased. I suspected she believed our conversation had gone exactly as planned and that I was ready to take the next step. I spent the day preparing a simple meal using recipes Harold had always loved. As I moved through the kitchen, I found myself thinking about the countless family dinners we had shared over the years. Birthdays, holidays, graduations, and ordinary Sunday afternoons had all taken place around the same dining table. This house was more than a building. It was a record of an entire life. By the time Michael and Rachel arrived, I felt calm. Not because the situation no longer mattered, but because I finally understood it. We ate dinner first. The conversation remained light and pleasant. Rachel talked about the grandchildren. Michael discussed a project at work. Nobody mentioned retirement communities or future housing plans. It was almost as though the family meeting had never happened. After dessert, I stood and walked into my study. When I returned, I was carrying the locked file box Harold and I had maintained for years. I placed it gently on the dining table. Both Michael and Rachel immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. The smiles faded. The room became quiet. Without saying a word, I unlocked the box and removed several folders. Inside were trust documents, estate records, property information, and letters Harold had organized long before his death. Michael leaned forward with curiosity. Rachel watched silently. I began explaining the structure Harold and I had established years earlier. Certain assets had been placed into trusts. Specific instructions governed major decisions. Long-term protections existed to ensure that no significant changes could occur without my direct approval. The more I explained, the more surprised Michael appeared. Rachel remained composed, but I noticed her confidence beginning to fade. Then I removed a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front belonged to Harold. I had not opened it since his funeral. Slowly, I unfolded the letter and began reading portions aloud. Harold wrote about family, responsibility, and respect. He wrote about the importance of listening before deciding what was best for someone else. Most importantly, he wrote about independence. One sentence seemed to fill the entire room. Love is not proven by taking control of another person's future. Love is proven by honoring their right to choose it. When I finished reading, nobody spoke. Michael lowered his eyes toward the table. Rachel stared quietly at the documents in front of her. For the first time since this situation began, neither of them seemed certain of what to say next. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I did not know Dad had prepared all of this," he said softly. I nodded. Most people did not. Rachel cleared her throat. "We were only trying to help." Her voice sounded different now, less assured, less confident. I looked directly at her. "I believe that," I said honestly. "But helping someone and planning their life without them are not the same thing." The words settled heavily across the room. There was no argument. No raised voices. None were necessary. The truth had already spoken for itself. As the evening came to an end, I carefully returned every document to the file box. Rachel and Michael left quietly. Standing at the front door after they drove away, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Peace. Rachel had spent a long time shaping a future she believed was best for me. What she had never considered was that Harold and I had already shaped our own future years before. And now, at last, everyone understood it. The days that followed felt different. Not because everything had suddenly become perfect, but because the uncertainty was gone. For months, I had sensed that something was happening around me. Conversations had taken place without my knowledge. Decisions had been discussed without my participation. Assumptions had been made about a future that belonged to me. Now, at least, everything stood in the open. About a week after the dinner, Michael stopped by the house alone. When I opened the door, I immediately noticed the difference in his expression. The tension that had followed him for months seemed to have disappeared. We sat together on the back porch overlooking the garden. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he finally looked at me and said the words I think he had been carrying for a long time. "Mom, I am sorry." His voice was quiet but sincere. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the afternoon sunlight move across the yard. "Sorry for what?" I asked gently. Michael sighed. "For letting other people make decisions I should have questioned. For assuming I knew what was best. For not asking what you wanted." Hearing those words brought me more peace than I expected. Not because I needed an apology. What I needed was understanding. Michael had finally recognized what had gone wrong. The issue had never been retirement communities or housing options. It had never been maintenance costs or future planning. The issue was respect. Somewhere along the way, concern had turned into control. Good intentions had replaced honest conversations. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, more honestly than we had spoken in years. For the first time since Harold passed away, I felt as though my son was truly listening again. Rachel called later that evening. Her voice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. She apologized as well. Not dramatically, not defensively, simply and sincerely. She admitted that she had become convinced she was helping. She admitted that she had spent so much time focusing on solutions that she stopped considering whether those solutions were actually hers to choose. I listened carefully. Then I told her something I had spent weeks learning myself. Good intentions do not excuse taking away someone else's voice. The line remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, she said, "I understand that now." And for the first time, I believed she did. As summer slowly turned toward autumn, life settled into a new rhythm. Family dinners continued. The grandchildren still visited. Rachel still called. Michael still stopped by to help with projects around the house. Yet one important difference remained. Nobody discussed my future without including me. Nobody assumed. Nobody planned on my behalf. Instead, they asked. They listened. They respected the answers they received. One evening, several months later, I found myself sitting alone on the back porch with a cup of tea as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The same porch where I had spent countless evenings with Harold. The same yard where our son had played as a child. The same home others had quietly decided I should leave behind. Looking around, I realized something important. The greatest loss I experienced was never the threat of leaving this house. It was the realization that trust can fade when people stop seeing you as capable. The greatest victory was not proving anyone wrong. It was reclaiming my place in my own story. Family is not measured by who makes decisions for you. Family is measured by who respects your right to make them yourself. I spent months wondering what was hidden behind certain smiles. In the end, the truth revealed more than I expected. It showed me who had lost their way. It showed me who was willing to learn. Most importantly, it reminded me that dignity does not come from what you own or where you live. It comes from knowing your voice still matters. And that was something nobody could ever take from me.